Dear all, it has been my pleasure to start it with this high noon in Museum of Revolution program at Historical Museum of Sarajevo. As you have been informed by our web page and by our promotional program, we will have a 3-day event with our prominent guests. It has been my pleasure to announce our first guest and speaker on this part of the program, Tamas. For those who are not informed, I will just a little bit in brief say about his impressive biography, and then also use the opportunity to explain to you how this panel should work. So Tamas is usually entitled as the most prominent Hungarian left-wing political intellectual. After participating in the Hungarian parliament as a representative of the Liberal Free Democratic Alliance from 1989-1994, he embraced Marxism at the beginning of the 21st century. There is a number of course, publications, essays, and books that he has been extensively publishing throughout the different publications. I just wanted to let you know that he presently teaches in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Central European University at Budapest. And we thought that...
As a visiting professor only.
Sorry, as a visiting professor. One course, am I right? As you mentioned yesterday, thank you very much. But I think that what we find that most useful for us in terms of the program and out of this is to basically speak about something that Gaspar is writing very much extensively and developing, and it's on post-fascism. And I think that will be a kind of our first introductory round, and later on we had an opportunity to speak a little bit of something that he's also very much engaged these days, and that's ethnicization after nationalism. Am I right?
Ethnicism, yeah.
Ethnicism after the nationalism, sorry. And in that respect, after these 2 rounds of presentations by Gaspar, of course you will have a chance to intervene and ask the questions, and so on and so forth. So my first question, instead of the introduction, will be basically a definition that Gaspar himself provided in his essay on post-fascism, when you write that you should define what you exactly mean by that. And you said that you take term fascism to refer to a break with the Enlightenment tradition of citizenship as a universal entitlement. That is to say, with its assimilation of the civic conditions to the human conditions, end of the quotation. So, Gaspar, please, post-fascism.
Right, thank you. So this is now a 15 years old essay. This was written and published in 2000 in Boston Review. And it's, you know, reflective of people's perception of the times, less of my own, that is republished quite frequently in various places. So what I really tried to establish, that one of the main characteristics of historical fascism was indeed the reversal of that tendency of bourgeois society, which would have at any rate go beyond the confines of bourgeois society, that is, in making the civic condition universal, i.e. there shouldn't be anybody but anybody without civic rights and without political rights, and there shouldn't be no limitations on this. That's, you know, the inherent goal of the tradition of the French Revolution and so on and so forth. Now, and this has been reversed by historical fascism by considering citizenship as a privilege, as a limited condition of participation in militant state building and extension of the limits of the state, both territorial and in intensity of power within the nation states or empires. And this, of course, was beaten, as it's well known, but it's by a curious further reversal, we can notice, we can observe that in various places and through various methods, while keeping the usual framework of parliamentary democracy, representative government, rule of law, to some extent at least. Active citizenship is increasingly limited. It's in some places is limited legally. Most conspicuously, that was, don't forget that was written in 2000, is limited to sedentary population and is denied to immigrants and to various floating and populations of guest workers and so on and so forth, and immigrants and so on. And so, of course, as indeed such a more or less conservative thinker like Hannah Arendt has established long ago, that one of the origins of fascism, of course, have been imperialism. So the legislations of various imperial powers to institute the two-layer political condition for colonials and for proper citizens, that was in vigor in France until 1959, the Code de l'Indigène. That's, you know, and it was actually de Gaulle who had to suppress it, you know, which regularized, that's very, very rare actually to be spelled out in that open fashion, that colonial subjects of the French Republic enjoyed some rights, but not the entirety of the rights, and the totality of obligations, and so on and so forth. And that was indeed that kind of legislation that instituted differences between citizens that were not based on the old caste system, or, you know, the differentiation between nobility and the ignoble people and so on and so forth, but instituted by the modern state in bourgeois society, that have been predicated on and built on the constitutional equality of all citizens. Hence, when they wanted to operate, when it came to the operation of real differentiated oppression and discrimination, well, then indeed it was to limit the civic condition. And there were old methods of this, the limitation of the franchise, you know, at one time, and so on and so forth. But under the dictatorial and even, although I don't like the term, totalitarian systems instituted by fascism, it was the first open declaration with the anti-Semitic laws in various countries. Historically, begins with Hungary. Its first was, yes, 21. And then, of course, in Nazi Germany, in Austria, and then in the various occupied countries by the Third Reich. And when the Jews were considered to be aliens, although they were part of the sedentary white population and recognized citizens with the fullness of rights in modern European societies. And, you know, the theories and the more or less sincere political doctrines of the majority of the modern states were based in the 19th century on nationalism. Nationalism, of course, as I say in my essay on ethnicism after nationalism, is a universalist doctrine. Nationalism is a version of universalism because it defines within the limits of the nation state a community of all, provided these people accept the dominant cultural characteristics of the dominant ethnic group and loyalty to the state, an obligation to its national goals, an approval of its military and territorial goals, and an appropriation of a national culture that puts a price on integration, unity, conformity with the dominant forms of culture. So therefore it's a universalist doctrine that would enable all citizens to participate in the political community if they are ready to pay a price, and that price is, of course, is the of ethnic assimilation. So, you know, how did come the French nation into existence? Of course, the most characteristic example of this, you know, in old France was as multi-ethnic as old Yugoslavia, and you know, many languages have been spoken, you know, Languedoc and Languedoc and all that kind of thing, that were already called, you know, during the French Revolution by none other by Saint-Just, you know, les patois contre-révolutionnaires, you know, the counter-revolutionary dialects. So all minority languages were considered counter-revolutionary against the unity of the nation. So, and if anybody, you know, if any Provençal was willing to speak, of course, literary French, was, of course, welcome to the unity of Frenchmen if he or she, but mostly he, was prepared to leave behind his or her ethnic identity. Now, and so this wasn't a peaceful or tolerant, of course I won't lie about nationalism, nevertheless, it did not at all, on the contrary, it did not decree biological differences or genetic differences or cultural differences between ethnic groups that are unbridgeable, and its goal was to create monolingual, unified, unitary nations with the same cultural characteristics, because of course you could accede, you know, you could step up to the highest condition that was in different, well, to be French or to be German or to be Hungarian and so on. You know, Hungary, you know, was a very, very conspicuously successful example of this, at least on most of its territory, where there was no religious difference. So it's very interesting that assimilation went on successfully, mostly with the Slovaks, who were Catholics and Lutherans, and not Greek Orthodox like the Romanians and the Serbs, who wouldn't, and which would stop even mixed marriages and so on and so forth. But you see, so therefore, it appeared, it was in Hungary the first time when religious denominational differences were the first time assimilated to ethnic differences in the state doctrine. So they were subversive religions, Greek Orthodox religion and so on. And because it seemed to them to be an obstacle in the face of assimilation. Okay, so in the aftermath of the momentous changes in Europe, especially, not exclusively, but especially after '89, the universalist nationalism of early bourgeois society has not been recreated. The new states born after '89 in Eastern Europe, but the same processes are going on in other parts as well, for slightly different reasons, have found themselves in a political situation in which the general conviction with the vanishment, with the disappearance of active universalist citizenship of any kind, with the loss of a certain kind of basic political conflict previously characteristic for bourgeois society, I will go into it in a moment, universalist features defined mostly by the class struggle seemed to disappear, and there was no way in which people in this new dispensation could allow that cultures are not the ultimate reality, that ethnic coexistence are not the ultimate reality, because the ultimate reality can be defined only by biology and by culture, and not by politics. So therefore, you know, ethnic groups seemed for people to be, seem to people to be, the ultimate reality, the defining feature, fate, destiny, if you wish, that cannot be left behind. Assimilation is impossible, and all other ethnic groups, even if they are not adversaries or enemies, they are radically other, you know, as it was called in, you know, 80s, 90s, very characteristic term. And so therefore, polities built on multicultural arrangements or multi-ethnic arrangements seem to people to be sheer impossibility, going against human nature, going against the essence of culture and so on. I mean, I don't need to tell you in this town how these things were thought about, and to a certain extent, in a more peaceful manner, are still thought about. And this is why every little ethnic group must have its own enclave and its own little autonomy or whatever, because not because we necessarily hate the others, but self-government means to many people in many parts of the world ethnic self-government, to be ourselves and to exclude others. If without conflict, okay, with conflict then that can happen too. And you know, that means the disappearance of all universalist features of modern politics, because of the disappearance of a very important player in modern bourgeois politics, that has been the organized working class. Okay? The organized working class. That, the resistance of it and the reactions of bourgeois society to it, for a while, fixed the main political conflicts elsewhere than cultural, ethnic, racial, denominational, and other conflicts. After all, the class conflict is international. It shows, you know, political actors and human beings in general to have at least some features that are not subordinated to their cultural determinations and ethnic and racial determinations and so on and so forth. So it's not a politics of identity in any way, but it's a I inherited, but you know, it's something that was in need of constant reimagination, reconfiguration, and so on and so forth. And it was recognized to be the main enemy. And from the 19th century, of course, the symbolic and actual conflict between socialism and capitalism, which was also a fight between proletarians represented by the organizations and bourgeois society represented by theirs. And of course, for the first time, you know, that was already adumbrated in Marx's work on Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, that there was a possibility that based on other determinations than the class determinations, it is possible to mobilize parts of the working classes against socialism. And it was the first breach in the universalist conflict between capitalism and socialism in a political way, in a very effective, actually very effective political way, which was of course repeated in a much grander manner by National Socialism, obviously. And so with the disappearance of the Soviet bloc, and I include Yugoslavia in that too, I mean the Soviet-style society in China, I mean the Soviet-style societies, and their transformation into whatever it is now, is whatever we think about those societies, and what I think is not very complimentary, but it was historically and socially and symbolically representing the other, representing resistance to capitalism, and represented by power, by armies, by state symbolisms, by flags, by cultures, by buildings, a huge civilization that not totally alien from capitalist modernity, but certainly a very different version of it. And, you know, and we can witness, I just went through Sarajevo, where, you know, you can see you know, Austro-Hungarian little streets, very familiar to me from my childhood on, you know. Then you can see, of course, the mosques, the role of which were played by Greek Orthodox churches, came from the East, and the Stalinist great avenues, you know, and all that. So, you know, it's visible. There was a historical period. You can see, like, Gothic cathedrals, you can see the Stalin, you know, barracks style that was, and of course the new housing settlements that of course are part of a civilization. It existed, but had its own force. So now that this vanished, and with this together, you know, from the 70s on, the Western workers' movements have been weakened considerably. It seems that discrimination, inequality, oppression, and so on will have to be understood in other terms. And you can see also that even the left is understanding oppression, discrimination, inequality mostly in terms forced upon us by the adversary. In ethnic terms. In ethnic terms. Well, yes. Immigrants, minorities, the Roma, the blacks. Of course, there are very real conflicts and very real injustices, no denying that, but it was the enormous strategic trick of socialist movements once to translate this into other and to raise these oppressed minority groups into players in a movement supposed to be the savior of all humankind. Why do you think there were so many minority people in all East European communist parties? You know, what was the name of the Secretary General of the Romanian Communist Party? Well, Elek Köbles. Is that a Romanian? István Forés. Béla Breiner, not only Hungarian but also Hungarian Jewish. You know, of course, and everywhere this was the case, of course, and because of course it was the salvation of the minority groups into something beyond ethnic movements of self-liberation and self-assertion and so on, which now people would of course consider to be dogmatically universalist, primitively Illuminist, I mean Illuminist in the sense of enlightenment, not Illuminati, and so on and so forth. And so you see that whole dimension doesn't play a very important role in the contemporary political world, and hence ethnicity appears as the absolute. But it's a variegated absolute, it's a local absolute, so it doesn't have true political dimension in the old Aristotelian sense of the word.
Well, thank you for this extensive introduction. Which
oh, sorry, that's too long.
Okay. It's in terms of time, but it's just opening for me quite a number of the problems how to continue with this. However, the two things that I might find as a connecting into this is, and I really was tempting to do so, but I will anyway. So it is kind of the natural to mention the Carl Schmitt and return of his political theory in terms of and political theology, of course, in terms of understanding these problems that are happening now. And I think mentioning Carl Schmitt is basically twofold, in a sense of return of this organic solidarity in terms of the mobilization of the ethnicity against inner and outsider enemies, whoever they are, in a way. So this kind of constant need to mobilize against, so friend and foe, so yes, to say, distinctions. But the second, I think also important element is return of the religion that you have been mentioning, in a way, to the public sphere. What I have in mind in that is that modern theory of nationalism usually ignore religion as important factor in creating these modern nations that you have been mentioning from the France, Germany, and so on and so forth. However, that was particularly the reason because they consider it secularism, the notion of nation as a secular notion of kind of a surrogate ideology that religion used to function in the previous times. However, it seems to be that they were a little bit of too early jumping into the conclusion, and now in the end of the 20th and 21st century, we might see, like in the case of Poland, for example, and it was not only the case of Poland, but it was the case of some other former, as you said, Soviet countries, the religious symbols were first profanized, but then resacralized, not as religious, but as national symbols. And that's a kind of, I would say, universal feature, at least in this part that we nominally called Eastern Europe. So I know that you have been referring in your works on Carl Schmitt, so I would like to push you a little bit more about that, if possible.
Yes. Just one historical remark. Defining nations by a certain religion is quite an old practice. I mean, think of the Inquisition, etc., etc. Persecution of Protestants in France and in Italy, and starting well, even before real Protestantism. The Waldensians being persecuted in Italy before the proper Protestant Reformation took place, and so on and so forth. And La fille aînée de l'Église and all that kind of stuff. So it was, of course, it played a role in pre-modern national, pre-bourgeois, let's say, a nation formation, and cleansing the national territory of religious aliens is as old as humankind. Yeah, of course, that's that always been the case. But of course, classical nationalism, purported on the whole to go beyond this, actually. And here Carl Schmitt plays an important role, because you see this whole caboodle about the exception, a state of exception, and so on and so forth. There's a point in which that's descriptively it's quite important, because indeed one of the most important decisions of the sovereign, that was his sovereign, was of course to decide who were to be henceforward the citizens, who would be the real participants in the political community and who would not. And that was indeed a sovereign decision, and it is to this very day, of course, in the it's in the hands of the sovereign in nation states to define this. It's very difficult, of course, nowadays to rob, long settled, respectable communities of their citizenship, and it won't probably happen, hopefully. But it's right, and so. But in the case of Nazi Germany, of course, this indeed has been decided by the United States, and so therefore, by a sovereign decision, it has been decided the German nation was to be defined on racial terms, and not in terms of participation in the political community. And so that the subsequent fate of this political position, of course, is very variegated. And of course, there's nothing new. It didn't have to wait for the modern ethnicism or the contemporary ethnicism to develop, because even before, the communities considered to be the basis of a nation state have been very frequently artificial or fictitious, and so on. Historians of nationalism, Benedict Anderson and others, anyway, quite fictitious, of course. And if you look at the real ethnic base of this, you are in sometimes with great disappointments. 2 years ago, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences has initiated a great research of the genetic composition of the Hungarian population, to know finally who we are. Well, more than 3/4 of us are Slavs. I'm sorry to say, that's what it is.
Nobody's perfect.
No, yeah, right. Yes, but given the anti-Slav tradition of Hungarian chauvinism,
right, exactly.
So it was just swept under the rug and nobody cares about it. You know how our greatest national poet was called originally, Petrović. And so, anyway, so fictitious it may be, and of course it was, in the case of Yugoslavia, of course. And religious denominations and traditional groups have suddenly, appointed to be nations and so on and so forth. But this shows again, these, I hate these terms, but they are still quite apposite. These post-political, right, condition of most countries today, that these things are accepted very easily, and that they are bases of political action. And when people perceive, in the contemporary world, perceive discrimination or injustice or whatever, they are suspecting, sometimes unjustifiably, sometimes no, some kind of ethnic bias on this. And you know, to see, for example, that in some places, well, take, I mean, a very modern and Western country, well, the westernmost European country, Britain, you know, the most rebellious left-wing party now is called the Scottish National Party. And of course it convinces, because of course it carries also a very important ethnic message, which is partly, it's a combination of old nationalism, partly, you know, the Gaelic ethnicism, and you know, all sorts of things are combined there, and a reinterpretation of history in this kind of populist way, meaning that as our fate was always to be the downtrodden and the second-rate and so on and so forth, you know, then of course our new national ideology will have to be defined in such terms. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, sometimes it is religion, sometimes it's history, sometimes it's something. It is totally arbitrary. And let me tell you that, you know, actually, you know, these religious definitions of ethnicity are even more fictitious than the others. In what sense is the Catholic Church, with theology and so on, the representative of the Polish nation? I mean, has St. Thomas Aquinas dreamt of being the inspiration behind some kind of, you know, second-rate reactionary Polish government, you know? And it was not about that. You know, of course, the Catholic Church has very strong political principles, and there's a very strong political tradition, and the political Catholicism even has defined. But of course, you know, beginning with Action Française and with such, you know, combined nationalist religious movements at the beginning of the 20th century, you know, the Catholic character of these movements is really secondary.
So to wrap up, before we open the floor to the potential intervention, I'm sure there'll be some, is in terms of this, what you have been started with the universality, if you like, of the concept of humanity, and this construct of opposition to that, in terms of well, basically, you have been mentioning the Hannah Arendt, and I do recall now, inspired by your introductory speech, that she once said that man who is just a man has no rights. And there is often this intervention that gap between human and citizens that you have been spoken in general terms of meaning can be somehow filled by the concept of the human rights and so on and so forth. So in a way, I'm very much, so to say, thinking in terms of these classical constitutional or critical legal studies who are questioning, you know, this dominance of the Western concept of the human rights, and whether they can fill this gap that you are talking about, of these different, even within the citizenship you have differences between them and between the citizens. So I don't know whether I have been consistent, but the paradox is that human rights to a certain extent help us, but also discipline something that we consider today a loyal citizens in a way.
Just very briefly now, I think that there's even some reason in the conservative criticism of the theory of human rights. Mm-hmm. When conservatives, I mean old conservatives, Burkean or Tocquevillian conservatives will say that rights will obtain only in a context where there are institutions, and the rights can be interpreted most successfully in the framework and the context of institutions, and guarantees can be operated by law, and law obtains only where there are institutions to formulate and implement them. There's some truth to this, and most certainly the development of modern bourgeois democracies bears this out. So, and especially and even the French Revolution, that of course has declared the University of Human Rights and had to introduce a very sharp political regime, a very, if you wish, oppressive, dictatorial political regime in order to implement it. You shouldn't think that the French revolutions weren't sincere in implementing human rights. They were most sincere, and Robespierre absolutely supremely sincere and consequent and honest about it. And so, you know, in a way, and this is why Joseph de Maistre admired him so much, because he drew all the consequences. He drew all the consequences, so that, you know, people who were indeed against his idea of humanity conceived in that way, you know, had no place in his new republic. And as universalism, understood literally, of course, also means the universality of the idea, not only of the practice, of the idea of this, the political practice. So people who would, you know, conduct intrigues against humankind are excluding themselves from humankind. And okay, so you know, so that's so that was indeed the most merciless and consequent regime of imposing human rights on a given territory where there was power, there was resistance, and there was society with all its complications. So there, of course, also, you know, critical legal studies, which has its own conservative features, historicism is quite right about this. And I'm not talking about what the human rights have been used in especially in this part of the world by the regimes after '89. Of course, they were used in order to introduce a constitutional regime that, of course, would pave the way towards introduction of ultra-market capitalism. But that, of course, is also falsifying it. I mean, so I won't reproach the idea of human rights to have done this, because, of course, there was a special application of that in this part of the world.
Thank you. Anyway, I think that needs to be said in a way in this part. So I think it's about time that we open the floor for you, for your intervention, questions, whatever. If any. Please.
Just talk about...
Just the mic, please.
So my question is about the perception of class struggle now in nationalism, especially here in Bosnia, because we have, for example, politicians who are basically very corrupt, and they are elite. They have their personal gain by policy and stuff like that. But also, they are tolerated because they are part of certain nation. And is this a threat to that notion of class struggle?
Well, you know, I mean, that's of course the oldest trick in all unequal societies. Why are, you know, elites tolerated, ruling classes, etc., tolerated by people who don't draw any visible material advantage from their existence and their rule? Because they can convince people that they represent something higher. You know, a higher cause, you know, public safety, the common good, running, you know, an adequate state with their, you know, secular experience, representing the national interest that is being threatened by outside forces, embodying the national ideal, or before, of course, being divinely anointed or representing tradition, a sacred tradition like the kings and queens did at one time, and so on and so forth. So, of course, there are many, many legitimizing principles and ideologies that are all, without exception, aiming at pretending at a higher unity than what, you know, immoral leftist evolutionaries would destroy by putting in the forefront the abject and dirty material interest. You know, there was the 19th century arguments against incipient socialism, and now you have, in a way, the opposite propaganda against socialism, namely this doctrinaire idea cut off from real life, run by intellectual doctrinaires in universities. Now it's too spiritual. Some time ago it was too material. But the idea is the same, namely to convince people that the interest of the majority, in spite of the material and political disadvantages, less wealth, less power, is to their own good, because of course it's superseded by superior interest. You know, that hasn't ever changed, and that's, in a way, if you wish, the eternal situation of all class and caste societies. That doesn't seem to be changed. We don't like it, and we still haven't changed it, have we?
Yeah, I wanted to, for the sake of controversy, ask a question about the point you made about the shift to ethnicism after 1989 and the end of a certain internationalism, because yes, and nationalism, because I mean, for example, you know, the late Chris Harman said of Eric Hobsbawm's book that, you know, when his discussion about nationalism in the Soviet Union, well, you know, you're not really taking into account what a worker from the Caucasus would have experienced living in Moscow without the rights of residency. You've forgotten about what they called in French les peuples punis, the whole entire nations that were deported. In other words, the history of great Russian chauvinism. Now, you can talk about the USSR being a certain kind of federation, but I'm not sure that what you called Soviet-style societies escaped any kind of national framework. And here's a phrase that I think you might like, because you called, I mean, you've called Leninism a kind of a false consciousness of kind of Rousseauian socialism. There's one writer, Nigel Harris, who wrote an interesting book, ending with conclusions possibly like yours and those of Hobsbawm, who about nations today, the owl of Minerva having, you know, arrived, and that's kind of it, really. I'm sorry, I'm not characterizing your position, but globalization and so on. But he says that, you know, Marxism, Leninism, in reality, was a kind of false consciousness of nationalist intellectuals around the world, and, you know, a set of nation-building projects. China and you know, the Arab world and Africa and so on. So, and you know, if the experience of the worker from the Caucasus, we could ask about the experience of the worker from Kosovo, you know, from 1945 onwards. So I'm not sure that if you want to look at the roots of nationalism today, I think I do have a problem with what you're saying, because often now people look back nostalgically, and this means that we don't really look historically at this problem. So I'll stop there too.
Yes. Yes, it's very good that you should say that, because of course my main contrast is not between ethnicism and internationalism, but between ethnicism and nationalism. Yes. So yeah. So you see. That's quite true, that indeed, well, false consciousness of the nation-building intelligentsia is a bit going too far, but there's some truth in that, because of course there were these nations in opposition to Western imperialism, in which liberation meant also, of course, national liberation, obviously, and so on, and also, we shouldn't forget that also, even the Russian Revolution of 1917 was, of course, in opposition to the great powers that wanted to continue the war, you know, and on both sides. And, you know, there was also a break with the West that was forcing this war on the peoples of the Orient, and so on. Now, we have no reason to doubt the sincere internationalism of the first generation of Bolsheviks. We have no reason to do that. Of course, it didn't last, like other things didn't last as well. And I'm the best witness to the nationalism of a communist state. After all, I was, for a long time, a Hungarian in Romania. And let me tell you, it wasn't very nice to be that. To be actually the symbolic target, in my case, only symbolic target of the dominant nationalism, being the enemy, and so on and so forth, undermining the national unity, and irredentist, and what have you, and which I'm not really, to put it mildly, and so of course these things existed, and indeed were. I'm a witness to this too. One of the major reasons of disappointment in the Stalinist system. After all, that what has been promised was to obliterate ethnic discrimination. That was one of the great promises of socialism, to put an end to that. And of course, it wasn't realized. And of course, there were various strands of this, indeed creating federations, and at the same time treating, you know, ethnic groups in a discriminatory fashion, and so on and so forth. But it's very interesting, for example, again, to go back to my homeland, when after '89, the Hungarian minority in Romania had to formulate its main demands. There were two main demands. One is the creation of a Hungarian autonomous region in the middle of the country there, in the secular region, and the recreation of the independent Hungarian State University in Cluj-Kolozsvár, my native town. Both were created in 1950. And this was the great demands of the conservative nationalist Hungarian ethnic party in Romania. They wanted their good old Stalinist institutions back. I mean, and they are the main demands, especially the autonomous region. It's still the main slogan of all Hungarian nationalist groups there. So, you know, that's very contradictory. But yes, there was indeed, especially from the 1930s, this idea of the downtrodden Easterners, suspiciously reminiscent of Mussolini's ideas over the young nations, of the proletarian nations, bourgeois nations, or even of some national socialists, but young nations and old nations. Recht der jungen Völker was one of the major Nazi books. You know, that's of course opposing Germans to the French. You know, the French were old, and you know, and everybody who wants something is always young. You know? That's the idea. And of course this anti-Western bias of Stalinist parties was increasingly important. And you know, and when it was born, by the time, of course, it was American imperialism and so on and so forth, and it was always emphasized, the American imperialism's racism. You know, the treatment of the blacks. When I first started reading newspapers, I was a small child when I started reading newspapers, and it was, you know, these horror stories, quite true, about the mistreatment of blacks in the South, in America. And so, you know, of course, yes, there was a combination. So I don't think that a Soviet system is some kind of ideal, even in the most indirect way, for, you know, overcoming ethnicism and so on. So no, of course not. But, you know, as indeed it isn't a model for many other things either.
One more question, and then we will...
Yes, there's a lady there.
Lady here.
Yes. Yeah, the mic.
General question, maybe a bit extended from this question about Bosnia. So you wrote your essay, Ethnicism After Nationalism, many years ago, you said. So what do you think, in what kind of ideologies do we live now in Europe?
Yes, actually, you know, I'm ashamed to say that I wrote a lengthy essay on the Bosnian problem.
That is my next question.
Yes, Yes, that's the 200 years war, it was called, when the whole thing, you know, this is about federal systems and oppositions to them and so on and so forth, and how, you know, the problems of Austria-Hungary were reborn very interestingly, and how, you know, the Austro-Marxist idea of cultural autonomy that was surprisingly enough realized in the Soviet-style states. It was not Lenin's idea of total self-determination that was realized in Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, etc., but the Austro-Hungarian theory of cultural autonomy and ethnic autonomy within a more or less unitary nation state. And it was about that. But, you know, all that is gone. All that is gone. What are the present-day ideologies regarding this? That's your question. Yes. Our ideas, our generations, are now living generations, ideas about the main political problems linked to any kind of moral approximation, injustice, non-discrimination, recognition of equality, you know, like the fashionable books, you know, redistribution and recognition and all that kind of stuff, refers to visible minorities, mostly to visible minorities, you know, ethnic and racial minorities, and then the countless other minorities that sprung up by virtue of their demands, women, the disabled, etc., sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. So we have a system, a network of minorities, together of course they are the majority, but they are not constituted as a majority, or very, very seldom, for which there is a generalized fight for recognition of their rights, because that's the terms in which we formulate things, and of course the other side, the reaction, is reluctant to recognize those rights, and so on and so forth. So the whole thing is shaped by groups that are mostly similar by being formed by more or less an accident of birth. You are born a woman, you are born gay, you are born gypsy, you are born in a certain place, and usually you are christened when you are too small to be able to protest. And so become member of a religious denomination by...
You are born into a religion, exactly.
Yes, well, more or less, because your parents will do that before. Yeah, I'm absolutely in favor of adult baptism. That's the only democratic way. And, yeah, and... yes, absolutely.
It's like washing a dog.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And yes, I'm very much in favor of that. And so you see, this is indeed a soil that is fertile for people trying to constitute fighting communities, to fight both for the universal recognition of their dignity and rights, and their right to live their lives as they conceive of it in an inherited way, or in a way prescribed by their innate characteristics. And this, in peaceful times, takes a tolerant shape. So, you know, I don't mess with you, you don't mess with me kind of ideology. You know, I don't prescribe you your sexuality, don't you tell me how to love. And this means that emancipatory movements that can change the nature of power are rendered thereby impossible. And, you know, you can, of course, achieve progress. You know, indeed, you know, the situation of the gays, of course, is much better than it used to be a few years ago, and so on and so forth. But you see the constant failure of various attempts changing the nature of the major factors of power, the economical, and social and political, and they regard coercion, and either deliberate and conscious coercion from state agents, or coercion from the conceptually constructed system of the so-called economy. You know, so that's the problem. It doesn't mean that I regard these demands and these movements as something evil. Of course not. But this is a very momentous change in the nature of doing politics, and you know, the old cause, the good old cause, you know, of the liberation of humankind, is not held along by this, because, you know, it's always reverting to the same. And you can see, you know, there are very, very simple and obvious examples of where the power is. Just look at what happened to Syriza in Greece, you know, that was forced to give up from one day to another, because, of course, the immense force of international capital has forced them to their knees. And this, forget tactical considerations and you know, moral judgments about the courage or not. That's unimportant, relatively unimportant. What is important is that through local movements of this kind, you cannot win. And so we don't seem to have even the ideological wherewithal to change things, at least to the extent in which the bourgeois revolutions, the very existence on which is sometimes denied, have achieved them.
Gaspar, thank you very much.
Not at all. Thank you.
So that would be that for the first round of High-End National Museum.
The Museum of Revolution.
And Museum of Revolution. Thanks a lot, and see you today in our afternoon part of the program at Sartre. We keep continue tomorrow again here, and then that would be that. Thank you.
Join us for lunch here.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone